And joining us now on the debate in the nation's capital, Yasser Naqvi, Liberal MPP for the riding of Ottawa Centre, and Fred Hahn, President of CUPE Ontario. And back here in studio, John O'Toole, Progressive Conservative MPP for Durham, Paul Miller, New Democrat MPP for Hamilton East Stony Creek, and Josh Yarterson, Policy Director at the Mowat Centre for Policy Innovation. And because this is Thursday, you are part of tonight's Your Agenda broadcast. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. That's on our website, tvo.org/theagenda, and on our Facebook page, facebook.com/theagenda. You can send us a tweet as well at twitter.com, #YourAgenda. So please jump in, join the debate. We'll put your comments up on the screen throughout the course of the program. Okay, you two in Ottawa and everybody here in the studio here in Toronto, thanks for being with us tonight. I want to start just by, oh, well, we got to do this off the top like we always do, right? Who are you married to, Paul Miller?
I'm married to your cousin, Carol.
Okay, so we put that out there for full disclosure as it is because we do that every time Paul's here. Let's put a couple of charts up here to get started with. Michael Smith, can we get this one up first? The road to the balanced budget. This is what the current plan is to get Ontario from, as you can see, in fiscal 2009-10, from a $19.3 billion deficit to 8 years from now, back to a balanced budget. That's 8 years away. And what did Dwight Duncan, the finance minister, have to say this summer in a speech to Ontario's public servants? Well, he said the following. He said the government of Ontario is spending $50 billion a year on salaries. That's more than half the government of Ontario's expenditures. And he suggested that if you froze salaries at current levels and the public service were the same size, you'd save $750 million per year. So that's why he is urging all of the broader public sector to temper its demands and to keep salaries frozen for the foreseeable future. Let's go around on this one. And Yasser, I'll go to you first. Can we balance the provincial budget without touching public sector wages in some significant way?
Well, Steve, I think what we need to do, obviously, is take a very balanced and prudent approach as to how we balance our budget. And the way we deal with our public service is part and parcel of that approach. I think we have to recognize that we have a very competent and professional public service in the province of Ontario. Our nurses and our teachers are the backbone of our communities. People want services, and our job as a government is to protect a job. So we need to work together.
No, I get all that, Yasser. Sorry to interrupt, but I get all that. But what I need to know is, can you balance the budget without freezing salaries or even cutting salaries?
Well, the government, as you outlined, has put together a plan. Part of that plan is to ensure that we bring certain measures like wage freezes. We've already done so for MPPs for 3 years and other non-bargaining units. If you follow the plan, that includes reducing the size of public service by 5% by March 31st of 2012. We feel that in 7 years or so, in a responsible fashion, we can balance the budget.
Okay, let me go to the official opposition. John O'Toole, what's your view on that?
Well, I think they have a serious spending problem, and clearly I wouldn't agree with the 50% of the total spending is public sector wages. Probably greater than that. They say it's probably 60-65%. And that being said, Steve, I think we're all in it together. It's a weak economy, and I think we have to share it. I think it's not just the public sector's fault. It's the economy's fault, as well as the lack of jobs in the broader economy. And I think there's a lot of waste in government at the moment and a lot of use of consultants and money that's not as accountable. And the Premier has made a promise that he would limit the growth and freeze. But the two latest arbitration rulings have indicated, whether it's the OPP at 5% or the nurses and the other healthcare workers at 2%, these are increases. These are increases beyond the rate of inflation. So what they're doing now is unsustainable. And they're the government, and to my sense, they're taking about to almost 2020 to balance their budget by any real numbers. And if you look at the fundamentals, the biggest piece of the budget, Steve, is the healthcare piece, about 46% of all spending. And they forecast in their expenditure side 3% that they're going to fund healthcare. That's simply false. It's completely in error.
Because it'll be way more.
It's 6 to 8% over the last several years. So there's no truth in the budget numbers that I'm reading, and we're still to hear what their real plan is.
Okay, let me go to Paul Miller. Can you balance the provincial budget without touching public sector wages?
Yes, you can. I disagree with the figures that were just mentioned. I guess since for 25 years, 52.3% in 1981 was the budget for public sector. It's now 39.4% in 2007 and dropping.
Hang on, say that again.
It's been dropping for 25 years.
The percentage.
The percentage
of the budget?
in 1981 it was 52.3%. In 2007 it's 39.4% and dropping. Public sector settlements fell behind the private sector for 16 years, from 1992 to 2008. So I'm not quite sure where they're getting their figures from, but that's not true. And I must concur with the other opposition member that you know, some of the spending that's been going on and all the boondoggles that we've uncovered in the last few years under this government, from e-health scandals to all the other scandals, and there'll be more coming, is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars wasted on consultants.
So do you think that Dwight Duncan is putting out the 55% of government expenditure figure in order to kind of, well, what? You tell me.
Well,
you think it's lower than that?
I think it's probably a little bit of an intimidation maneuver to get the unions to back down. I feel that you know, what are you going to do? Take the right for you know, negotiate a settlement? Their settlements they're up, and you can't take away bargaining from its law in Ontario. And these people have a right to bargain contracts. And if they are responsible on both sides, they can come up with a number that's sufficient, that won't damage the budget as much as they're claiming. Okay,
let's hear what CUPE has to say in Ottawa. Come on in on that, Fred.
Well, I think from our members' perspective, what's most important is to focus on the economy. It does none of us any good to have less money circulating in the economy, and that's really what a wage freeze or a compensation freeze would do. What we need to do is focus on job creation. Everybody knows that we need more jobs in the province. It's the way to get to grow ourselves out of a deficit. We all understand that there's a deficit and that it needs to be dealt with, but government has choices, and we think it's important for government to make choices that work well for people. There are real ways that government can use tools and levers and invest to help to spur the economy. I was just at the Toronto Board of Trade the other morning. They were talking about public transit. For every dollar invested, their figures show that it generates $2 in economic activity. Economists have said in the summer, they put in an independent report that talked about investments in childcare. For every dollar of government money that goes into childcare provision, $2.42 are generated in the economy. So there are ways to deal with the challenge of the deficit that doesn't have to take money out of the economy. In fact, strategic investments can help to grow the economy, create jobs. That's good for everyone.
Okay, appreciate the fact that you're here representing CUPE and your members, and therefore, obviously, you don't think cutting back on their salaries is the right way to go. You said there's other ways. Give me one other way.
Well, I also want to just be clear about who CUPE members are. I think it's important for this discussion for people to understand that our members are looking after seniors in long-term care facilities. They're looking after children in childcare facilities, working in schools, in universities. The average salary of our members in the province of Ontario is $38,000 a year. These are folks that, you know, form the backbone of their local economies.
No, Fred, we hear you. I hear you. You're not a bunch of fat cats getting rich at the trough. I understand that. You're doing some of the hardest work in the province and compensated, you know, relatively speaking, about average to most people who live in the province today. But if you're saying that your members ought not to be the target of any kind of deficit reduction strategy, then I think it's incumbent upon you to put another idea on the table. As you said, there are other options. So what else then to reduce the budget deficit?
Well, there are many options. I talked about strategic investments that the government could make, but there's also a revenue problem.
Hang on, Fred. More public spending doesn't reduce the deficit this year. So if you've got another idea for this year, what is it?
I'm getting to it. It was, there's a revenue
It's an hour show, Fred. Let's go.
There's a revenue problem that the government has. In the same budget where they talked about this compensation freeze, they also introduced a corporate tax cut that cost $2.3 billion for all of us from the coffers of the government. What that means is that there's less money for services that we all need. So we think that there's ways, absolutely, that government could say, look, we could postpone that. There's no requirement for any of the large corporations, many of whom are back to making record profits, to invest $1 in the province of Ontario.
So raise corporate taxes is your idea?
No, I'm talking about freezing them.
Freezing
the government
okay.
introduced a plan to reduce corporate taxes. We have one of the most competitive and lowest corporate tax rates in our jurisdictions, in our region.
Okay,
There's
Fred.
no need to do
I
that.
appreciate that. Let's, Josh, you got maybe just a word on the Mowat Center. This is a think tank that is relatively middle of the road, I think it's fair to say.
That's right, nonpartisan, Ontario-centric, looking at national public policy issues through the Ontario lens.
So your view on this about whether or not you can balance the books without touching public sector salaries is what?
Well, statistics damn lies and statistics. So I called over to Statistics Canada today and actually got some data on this issue. And it's a fact that the average public sector wage has increased by 22% over the last 5 years. The average private sector wage has increased over 18% over the same period. If you look at the Ontario Ministry of Labour statistics, the average 3 years public sector wage public sector settlements around 2.6% annually, whereas the private sector wage settlements around 1.8. So it's clear to me that there is upward trends in public sector higher than elsewhere.
You've started the clock 5 years ago. If you started the clock 10 years ago, would you get a different look? I mean, it's very important where you start counting, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, in fact, the trend is even. I mean, the trend is relatively the same. Like you see, just on average, the public sector public sector salaries are increasing at a faster pace.
So therefore, if that's the story, what are you recommending?
Well, I think that any plan to tackle a deficit has to look at wages. I mean, there are other elements to any holistic plan. You've got to look at other items as well, but certainly public sector wages are part of the issue. I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we said no.
Dalton McGuinty likes to boast, John, let me go to you on this, that in the past 5 years, work stoppages in Ontario are the lowest they've ever been since people started keeping track of this kind of thing. And he's proud of that.
Well,
he says we have.
Yeah, it's peace in our time. It's the Neville Chamberlain line, and basically he's bought peace, and I suspect you could argue that he might get better rewards. I don't know, results, but I believe in peace in the public sector. I think they're essential services in many cases, and I think he has bought peace. And
at too high a price?
Well, I guess my sense, I'm not going to criticize the work that was described by Fred, people working in long-term care and health care, education. These are important. I would never want to devalue that, but I think we're in it together. When the economy's not growing, you can't expect to be taking a larger and larger piece of that economic pie. Fred talked about growing the economy, and part of that is public services actually don't create wealth in themselves. They distribute money, but public services raise our standard of living, our quality of life. I don't dispute that. But you have to cut down the tree to make some value-added production in the overall equation. And that's the part of the economy that's hurting. We're shedding jobs. 272,000 people are without jobs. And I think those are families that don't have a paycheck. So we can't say and discredit or disparage the public services, whether it's in long-term care or personal support workers. Not at all. But what we have to do is have the right tools in place to stimulate the economy. And I suspect Fred would probably agree with that. But public sector is a good example. Transit, which he mentioned, is the most heavily subsidized service in Ontario right now. The Metrolinx plan is they want an additional $5 billion a year commitment by the government. So I think we have to make choices. Part of it is going to be the capital plan, part of it's going to be the tax plan, and certainly the public sector have to be involved in.
I should get Paul Miller to react to that. You heard the numbers here from StatsCan. That's a pretty reputable middle-of-the-road organization without a political bias in here. They say the public sector over the past 5 years, public sector wages have done much better than private sector wages, and therefore, I think the conclusion is they have to make a greater contribution to balancing the budget.
Well, I wouldn't argue that point, but the fact is that in 1970, the public sector made up 23% of the jobs. And in 2009, it made up 18%. So it is shrinking. And governments are trimming, and they're cutting down in areas they should. You can't, if you look at the private sector, you've got a different ballgame, because I wouldn't feel that we have peace in the private sector. If you look at Stelco, U.S. Steel in Lake Erie, and you look at U.S. Steel in Hamilton, we've got people locked out. Inco was out for over a year. So I think companies are taking advantage of this situation and bullying, corporate bullying on unions and trying to break their back and try to move us back 30 or 40 years financially. And listen, if you erode your base industries and they're foreign owned, you don't have control over your economy, and that's what's happening in Canada.
Yeah, sir, I should get you to react to the question I put originally to John, which is, yes, we've had peace in our time, but have we paid too high a price for it?
Well, I think important thing, Steve, is that our Ontarians, our families demand good public services. They want good education system. They want a good healthcare system. All those investments made on those public services and other services, as Fred were mentioning, are important and they were necessary. We've seen in the past, I mean, the Harris government's approach was to just fire public servants. Well, that didn't help much at all when it comes to our healthcare education system. Or when NDP was in government last time around, they basically ripped contracts. That didn't help either. That's why we're trying to take a balanced approach. It's a two-pronged strategy. One, we need to bring some balanced measure of control over public spending. And like I mentioned, we started with freezing MPP salaries for 3 years, and we froze other political staff and other non-bargaining employees of the Ontario Public Service. But the other side of it as well is that we need to grow the economy as well. And this is where I may disagree with Fred a little bit, that we need to make sure that we make Ontario an attractive jurisdiction for companies to come and invest so that they can create private sector jobs as well, because those tax dollars money, in the end of the day, the ones we need to invest in our public services.
Okay, Paul Miller wants in.
Well, yeah, you have to realize too that you know, in the public sector, we brought a bill forward, the NDP, that we wanted to freeze salaries of CEOs at $400,000. That was shot down by the Liberals. So if they're fiscally responsible, that's not a good way to start.
I think they saw that as interfering in the market a little too much.
They felt that was interfering in the market, but if you talk to the people that are making $30,000 or $20,000, and you know, I have individuals coming into my office in Hamilton with mothers with 2 kids. They can't pay their rent, can't pay their hydro, and they're out on the street. And then you've got the Liberal government giving $1.5 million to consultants a day in one ministry, e-health, for the electronic cards. It's a little hard to explain to those people.
Well, I think, you know, I think we all agree we have to grow the economy, and it's just how we do. We have the Small Business Jobs Plan, which had 3 components to it. One of them was to eliminate the payroll taxes, or at least reduce them. Also the land transfer tax, which would stimulate the building industry, as well as eliminating the red tape, and addressing the apprenticeship issue for skilled trades. Those are 4 concrete plans that would have moved the small business sector of the Ontario economy and wouldn't have cost a lot.
And increased the deficit as well.
No, actually, those weren't direct subsidies. They would be increasing the revenue, because if business create jobs, people pay taxes. When you have 272,000 people out of work, Steve, right now we have the lowest or the highest unemployment rate in all of Canada, and have had since 2005. Those people aren't working, your revenue's down. And I think it was Yasser that said we have a revenue problem. We certainly do. When the economy's not functioning, you're spending money in service side, you're not creating wealth.
Well, let me get Josh on this. When Mike Harris got elected 15 years ago, one of the things they decided to do was shrink the size of government. Right. And they eliminated, you know, the jobs of thousands of public servants. Is that a prescription that you think makes sense for today?
Well, you know, actually, it's a good question. I mean, the result of that was a decline in public services, and I think that you saw a negative reaction to that. I think this issue about, you know, layoffs or wage freezes is kind of a bit of a red herring, and I think we actually need to take it a level, you know, through a different lens. We just actually wrote a report on this. It's called Shifting Gears: Path to Fiscal Sustainability in Canada, and we actually, like, other countries are doing different things and are able to achieve savings that are preserved services. I mean, for example, we have the federal government, all the provinces and territories have announced program reviews. They're looking for efficiencies, they're looking for savings. One of the things we identify is that this should be happening across governments, right? We have governments tripping over each other all the time. And just a personal example, my daycare, I mean, it has an inspection certificate from the province and an inspection certificate from municipalities. And I talked to the director, and it's absolutely, it's this.
They're doing the same thing?
Yeah, they're doing exactly the same thing, but it's different paperwork, and it's a different administrative hassle. You have 2 sets of bureaucracies running immigrant settlement systems in Ontario. You have 2 sets of bureaucracies running the student loan program in Ontario. I mean, so if we're going to talk about you know, making government more efficient, we need to focus our efforts and find areas where we can deliver services that people expect, that people want.
Let me try this with Fred. Fred, you represent the Canadian Union of Public Employees for Ontario. How many contracts have you got up in the next year?
Well, we're constantly in collective bargaining. We have the largest union in the province. There are literally hundreds of collective agreements up over the next year or 2.
And can we assume that, okay, can I assume from that that you would not be interested in the government's position, which is that you should, because of the economic times we're in, be satisfied with 0, 0, and 0% increases over the next 3 years, which is the length that most of these contracts go for. Would I be right in assuming that?
Well, we don't think it makes economic sense. We think that bargaining should be left to the employers and the unions to sit down at tables and make decisions that work for both of them. In the vast majority of cases, that's what happens. People bargain collective agreements that work both for the workers and for the employer.
Well, in fact, the Ministry of Finance has told us that 41 public sector collective bargaining agreements have been settled since the government announced its hope for a wage freeze. 18 of those 41 agreements included a wage freeze. That's about 40% of them. What do you infer from that?
Well, in some places, people are freely negotiating things that work for them. But it goes back to the bigger question, which is, does this make sense for the economy? Like, we were just talking about small businesses. And how do we support small businesses and communities? Every dollar that a public sector worker makes is actually invested back in their community, in their grocery store, in the gas station, in those small businesses, in their communities. It makes no sense to take less money from the economy. Bargaining will happen. It's part of the way we do business in the province of Ontario. It makes sense. It works for all of us, and everyone bargains.
John O'Toole.
Well, and Fred is right. I don't disagree. Again, I think, but where did that money that goes to the pocket of the public sector and then goes to the corner store or the gas station come from? Do you understand? The wealth has to be created by the growth in the domestic economy. And if you haven't grown the economy, you don't grow the economy with public services. They're important, but they're a result of the health of the economy itself. We know the economy is suffering, and when the economy is suffering, revenue slides. When revenue slides, the public sector and the service levels, as I agree with you, are going to be affected.
John, let me ask you, though, do you think we need to go back to a kind of hair-style prescription where we lay off thousands of public
servants? Well, I think it's
servants?
unfair. Let's put it in perspective. Right now, in 1995, I was chair of finance in my municipality, and I met Floyd Logren and Bob Ray, and they were told that they had an expenditure reduction plan. As you said at the opening, you had the social contract. The budget was $48 billion, the deficit was $12. Right today, our budget's roughly $100 billion, and our deficit is 20. That's 20 cents in every dollar we're borrowing into the future. That's future taxes. Then you look at the fundamentals of their budget are all wrong. Debt interest in our budget today is $10 billion. If the interest doubles, it's going to be $20 billion. So we have a fragile economy. We're dependent on exports to the United States.
Okay,
and public services cost money, and you have to create the money to pay for it.
Does your party believe in laying off public servants in order to help balance the books?
Our view would be that the government right now has blown it. Technically, they said there was going to be a freeze. There's really no freeze. Even your statistics show they had a settlement with the OPP, 6%, and guaranteed them to be the top paid.
John, no offense, I'm not hearing an answer here yet.
Well, I say we would honor contracts for sure. We would look for efficiencies.
But do you need to lay people off in order to help balance the books?
I think there would be efficiencies means you would find new and more effective ways of doing things. The double inspectors, for instance, and I look at the LINs and I look at the Ontario Power Authority. There's efficiencies within the government. Look at the electricity sector. There's about several regulating organizations.
So you don't need to lay people off, is your
I
position?
think there's efficiencies, and I think at the upper management as well in some of those organizations. The LINs and the OPA have doubled the number of people making over 100,000.
Let me get Paul to speak to this. You know that as you compare public and private sector over the last few years that we've been in this great recession, people who were in the private sector and saw their jobs disappear, and I don't have to tell you about that. There are lots of them who live in Hamilton, East Stony Creek, who used to work at U.S. Steel. I can't call it that. Stelco. Used to call it that. You're a former member of the Steelworkers Union, right? So you know all about this. They think they've taken it on the chin way more than anybody who works in the public service. And when they see that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm not sure any police officers or any, firefighters or any teachers.
They're associations, they're not unions.
They're
essential service.
Understood, but there were no layoffs in those sectors,
no.
The likes of which there were among steelworkers or people in manufacturing and so on. And they are asking, when does the public service make a contribution to reducing the deficit in this province?
Well, I hear you, but what the problem is here is the private sector is taking advantage of this. They try to pit the private sector against the public workers, and what they do is they make an all-out attack on the private sector. U.S. Steel, perfect example. They want concessions, they want benefits, they want to lower wages, and when they do that to the people out there, certainly the people are going to turn, well, why isn't the government following suit? Why do we have to go backwards instead of forward? Why are these companies allowed to decimate, unions, try to break their back, try to lock them out for a year and 2 years at a time, because it's foreign controlled? If you have so many foreign companies controlling our economy, we don't have control. If you look at Quebec, Steve, they don't get strikes in Quebec because they have anti-scab legislation. They don't last very long. If they last 2 weeks and they're back to work. Somebody's finding the money somewhere to pay those people. They didn't lower their wages, they're back to work. So I think it's a corporate move to pit public sector against private sector so that the private sector is going to put pressure on the public sector to take a hit too.
Okay, let me ask Yasser this. Yasser, the Minister of Finance, I think, was clear in his speech earlier this year when he said, we're not passing a law forcing a 0% resolution to all of the collective bargaining agreements we've got out there, but we're strongly telling you that's what we think it should be, and we're not going to give you any more money, all of you public sector agencies and organizations. We're not going to give you more money if you negotiate beyond 0%. Why not just remove all ambiguity and say, we're passing a law, it's 0%, that's it? Why didn't you do that?
Well, Steve, I think our approach is a responsible and a realistic approach. It's our responsibility to honor all collective bargaining agreements that exist. We are not going to do what NDP did back in the 90s and rip those contracts. We respect the work which public service does. And realistically speaking, as Fred was saying, it's a bargaining process, and we respect the law, and we let the unions and the management bargain. Our recommendation is that given fiscal situation that we are in right now and the overall measures the government has to take, that everybody take 0 for 2 years, not 3 years, by the way, you mentioned earlier, 0 for 2 years, and we'll move forward. So that's the response we've taken, and we made sure that we made it clear that the government will not be passing any dollars in terms of fiscally if there are any increases in the contract in the next 2 years.
But here's the I guess here's the difficulty with that, and that is that some unions and management who have not been able to come to an agreement have had to go out to arbitration, and the arbitrators have said, there's no law here. There's no law forcing 0, so we're going to give you what, we don't care what the government has to say. And they've been giving 2% increases over 2% a year over 2 years or 3 years. So it's not, I guess my question is, you may have this as a piece of advice to these organizations, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Well, I think what we've seen already on average that that provincial public sector contracts are below average when it comes to compared to private, federal, and municipal contracts that are being settled. So I think we're already seeing a net decrease in the rates of settlement that are coming through, and you cited some numbers. So we're already starting to have a sort of a positive impact in terms of restraining or having some savings when it comes to those spendings. Again, I think that the key is to ensure that we are not only protecting very key public service, which people demand and need, rightly so, but also protecting public service jobs because they're important in terms of providing the services.
Let me get Josh on this then. Josh, you've seen the arbitrators have come back and said, in the absence of a law, we don't have to take the government's advice of 0% into account. We're going to do what we want, and they've been, awarding higher contract results.
Yeah.
Does that mean the policy is not working?
Well, I don't know if I have the, if I can, but I mean, to respond to that point about, one thing that you said was true, and that is that we do see in 2010 that the public sector, private sector wage settlements are actually, they mirror each other now a little bit more than they did before. So I mean, I do agree that there is some movement there. Whether or not the policy is working, I mean, certainly whether or not this is actually foreseen by the government, whether or not the arbitrator would side this way is interesting. I think in many ways it was a moral cue, and the arbitrator obviously didn't pick it up.
Paul.
Well, obviously it's not working. The nurses just signed for 2%. They're for the next 3 years. They're going back at 2%, so they obviously weren't listening to Mr. Duncan. And I find it amazing that Yasser mentions that they respect collective bargaining. I believe they forced the transit workers back to work. They forced the university professors back to work, legislated them back to work. So I'm not quite sure that's respecting bargaining, there's equal bargaining. So
let's be honest.
I have a problem with that.
There's no virgins left on this file, right?
That's right.
I mean, you guys ripped up public service agreements 20 years ago with the social contract. You weren't there, but
Bob Ray was there. He was a liberal, but that's okay. Okay.
Bob McKenzie from Hamilton East, the labor minister, agreed with that social contract. You can't blame it all on Bob Ray. Anyway, John, you want to say?
Yes, there's certainly they've committed the 2%, as you said, the arbitration hearings. I believe it's stealth, reduction of service by stealth. When they say they're going to freeze the wage cap, the transfer payments to hospitals and schools, etc., that means hospital in Peterborough just has to go through a restructuring, laying off nurses. They have to pay severance, created $8 million of additional deficit because they have a deficit. So when you don't transfer more money, they lay the people off. That's what happens. So whether it's in the hospitals or long-term care or in our daycares, those public sector workers will be let go.
But are you arguing they should transfer more money to take into account
well,
these
no, I said
arbitrators'
freeze
rulings?
means freeze. And I think flat line is the way to go. People, whether it's the tax cut side or the spending side, they have a fiscal problem, spending too much, and they have a revenue problem because they're spending too much on the service levels.
Well, Steve.
Go ahead, Yasser, and then I'll
Yeah,
get Josh in.
this is the problem I'm always having with the conservative position. I mean, they really don't have a plan. I mean, again, John is speaking from both sides of the argument. On one hand, he's sort of dodging the question whether we just fire public servants.
What are you going to do?
And versus saying that we need more money in our healthcare system. Again, their position is absolutely not clear. They really do not have a plan when it comes to as to how they're going to manage the budget. And the only way I see it that they're going to deal with it is what they did back in the mid-90s, and that's just go on a wholesale reduction of public service and impact services.
Well, he's already said they're not going to do that. Mind you.
Well, but again, I'm not hearing any solution or plan either.
Okay. Quickly to John and then to Josh.
You've had several years here to deal with it. All the hospitals are in deficit. The CCACs, long-term care, all of it's in deficit, Yasser. It's half your budget, and your plan isn't working. It's a promise that's not kept, and it's typical. No, you're asking what our plan is. You'll see our plan, and the people of Ontario will see our plan. You're the government. You work with it.
When will we see your plan?
The plan right now is being discussed. Quite honestly, our position, they've copied on the energy file. We call it's an economic policy, not a kind of a social policy, which is what the whole green energy bill is all about.
Okay, Josh, to you.
Well, I mean, I'd just like to take on the characterization that the revenue problem is actually the government's problem. It's their doing. It's more complex than that. I mean, in Ontario, 60% of its revenue is from personal income tax, corporate income tax, and sales tax. That's the highest in the country. The other parts of the country, benefit from resource revenues. They benefit from greater federal transfers. I mean, it's a complicated story. I mean, that suggests perhaps there's also movement upwards, right? So to have like a knee-jerk reaction that this is permanent and somehow that we need to do a slash and burn or something like that, it simply is not realistic.
Let me get one comment from Fred, one from Paul, and then we're going to bring Mike Miner in here. Go ahead, Fred.
Well, I think it's important for everyone to understand what zero actually means. We know that costs are going up every day. We know it's winter. We're all paying for heating, and those costs are escalating enormously. StatsCan says that inflation in Ontario is over 2%. In fact, it's actually over 3%, 2% across Canada. So, if we're talking about what's fair and reasonable for people, earlier we talked about public sector wages. It's important, as you pointed out, to look at the long haul. If we look from 1992, wages actually didn't keep pace with inflation, didn't keep pace with those in the private sector. And the reality for those workers who form the backbone of local economies is they just have less money to spend. They're having to pay for higher hydro costs, higher costs in general, fuel costs, etc. They have less money to spend in the local economy. This makes no sense for any of us. It makes no sense for small business owners. It makes no sense for anyone. What we need is a plan to actually create jobs so that we can put people back to work. That's going to be the best way to deal with the deficit.
Paul Miller.
To deal with the deficit, I blame it totally on waste. You take the e-health scandal, the electronic health
there's
cards.
not $18 billion of waste in the government.
There is hundreds of millions, Steve. Just one file alone, e-health, with the e-health, I asked them what they got for the $388 million they spent in 4 years for those cards. They told me they got $100 million worth of hardware, software, and programs out of that. I said, where was the other $288 million? It was for consultants. They spent over 50% of the budget on consultants. Now, Steve, that's one ministry. There are 22 ministries. There are another 186 agencies or commissions that the Ontario government controls. So I dare to say it's probably into the billions. You want some money to help to put into services for the people of Ontario, you might start saving money.
Okay, take a breath, everybody, as we're having this discussion here in the studio and in Ottawa. Mike Miner, who's our fifth column blogger, if you go to our website, tvo.org/theagenda, he is the guy who has been moderating our online chat tonight. And Mike, come on in here and tell us what people are saying.
Sure, Steve. It's a very hot topic on here. People are coming at it from a lot of different angles. We have Joni online. She's commented on our blog post saying that she sees what has to happen is they have to scale back the compensation that public sector workers are giving. She's very frustrated, and the way she sees it is that the government is spending taxpayer dollars to bail out public sector pension plans, and there's so much money going to, she sees it as pampering, and she doesn't see that her in the private sector trying to finance her own retirement is getting the same kind of help. Larry says that when a public sector worker has to go to the dentist or optometrist for services, he doesn't get to ask for a wage freeze from the dentist. So he sees this as just a frustrating passing the buck and things that are making his own life difficult. CJ's coming at it from the perspective where just for the love of God, whatever you do, just don't raise our taxes. And Sonny Young, I mean, he kind of puts it all together where he says, the government should just do whatever it can to keep labor peace because it's an election year. So I guess that's some advice that McGuinty could look to.
Okay, Mike, you keep monitoring the chat online, and people can continue to weigh in with their views, and from time to time we'll put them up on the screen as the evening proceeds along. I want to read something as we move into the home stretch of our discussion here. This is from the editor-in-chief of The Economist magazine. Not exactly a friend of the New Democratic Party, Paul, but you won't mind my quoting them anyway. Here we go. John Micklethwaite says, the main political battle of the year 2011 will be between suddenly thrifty politicians and public sector unions. The latter may find little sympathy from their brothers and sisters in the private sector. Average pay in the public sector is higher, retirement often earlier, and pensions relatively lavish. The unfunded pension gap for state and local employees in America could be as high as $3.4 trillion. Bureaucrats may well start to replace bankers as a public target of opprobrium. Let's get some reaction to that. Yasser, what's your view on that comment from John Micklethwaite of The Economist?
Well, I'm assuming that the author of that column is bringing a European angle to it, because I think things are quite different what's going on in Europe right now, and we can see that what's happening in the UK or Ireland or Greece for that matter. North America, of course, has fared this recession far better. Canada in particular. There are challenges. Federal government is facing a $56 billion deficit. Ontario is about $18 billion right now. But I don't really see that there's this tide turning versus private sector versus public sector.
Forgive me, let me challenge you a little bit on this. Retirement is often earlier in the public sector in Ontario than in the private sector. Pensions are better in the public sector than in the private sector for most people in the province of Ontario. So there are some facts that he mentions there that are consistent with this province as well, are there not?
They may be, and I mean they may be, but I don't think that at least what I can tell you when I'm out in my riding in Ottawa Centre and talking to people, that is not the biggest issue that people are raising. I think what people are really concerned with, they want to make sure that the economy is growing, but they also want to protect their public services. They do want to continue to have good healthcare, public healthcare system, and education system. So I think we in Canada is always sort of somewhere in the middle on this, and we don't have really extremist views as we're starting to see in Europe or maybe in the United States.
Josh, you know what the expression is, though. When the well runs dry, the animals tend to look at each other differently.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Yasser in the sense that, Ontario is not, Greece, it's not. I mean, you look at, Greece's, public debt, it's 100% times GDP, and UK, Japan, Italy, I mean, they're approaching similar levels. We're talking 31%. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good news story in Ontario, but it's not it's not a horrible crisis news. I think, and this is the problem, I think that we're talking here about, wage sector freezes. We need to be more strategic than this. We need to I mean, it's absolutely true. 46% of our dollars are spent on healthcare, right? We need to think about how to refinance. This is really, this is the elephant in the room. We need innovative solutions, and unfortunately, we don't hear from any party right now in terms of a real dialogue about things like social insurance, right? Linking expenditures to, people, they see it off their paycheck every month. This is a dedicated healthcare expenditure. Getting people talking about these types of solutions. I
want to know from John O'Toole whether or not you represent one of those 905 ridings, right? Durham region. Are you seeing among people who make their living in the private sector a kind of envious look at those in the public sector, as in they've been shielded from a lot of the recession and their benefits are better, that kind of thing? Well,
you're right. I think it's summarized quite well. In fact, job security and early pensions, a lot of them have a 75 factor. That means retire when you're 50, 52. This is not sustainable, and pensions across the board, across the world, are in trouble. And 75% of the people in Ontario don't have a pension. They have OAS and CPP is what they have. So when you talk small business, they don't have the security. If their business fails, maybe they've lose their home. So the public sector, without being disparaging about it, I want that understood clearly. We need the services and people expect the services. We're all in it together, and when the economy's flat, we have to deal with it, and it has to be dealt with collectively. And I think if I'm hearing Fred properly, this will come out in negotiations. What services are the most vulnerable? I think the elderly today are frightened. High taxes, high interest, high everything. Now, in terms of heating your home and all the simple things, the biggest scare I have at all of this is the U.S. is printing money like it's free. And that is inflation in the future. That's going to affect interest. That's going to make a mortgage collapse, as well as the potential of seniors losing their homes and the cost of debt for Ontario. We have to deal with this today, and it has to be strategic, as you said as well. Grow the economy. This is about the economy and jobs, really, at the end of the day.
Okay, can I get your view on that, Paul, whether there's envy between the public and private sectors here?
I think there's a little of that out there, Steve. I mean, certainly, with example Stelco and the strikes they got to go through, and the the cost, a tax on their pension plans, a tax on their jobs, a tax on their benefits. This certainly plays on their minds. But as pointed out by everyone here, Ontarians love their services. They love their good health. We brag about our health system throughout the world, and we're very proud of it. And we're happy with most times with schooling, even though we're 10th in Canada for tuitions. But that's beside the point.
Tell me if you think this is unfair. Ontarians want Cadillac services. They want to pay Chevy-style taxes to get them. That's a good point.
Well, that's a fair statement. I mean, but when you're in an economy and you're constantly under attack from corporations, and your wages are going down, the services are going up, and the costs are serving, that's going to happen.
Okay, Michael Smith, Director, can you pop up that next email that we got there, and we'll get some discussion about that. Here we go. In the private sector, majority of employees are underpaid, while the privileged few, senior executives, CEOs, are overpaid. What we need now is to raise the wages for average workers in the private sector. That came in via our website tonight. Fred, I imagine there's not going to be too much argument from you on that. Would you like to see it go even further, though? Would you like to see a law in Ontario capping executive compensation?
Well, I just want to go back for a second to pensions. I do want to get to this
No, don't
point.
go back. You have to deal with the email. Hold
All
on.
right.
I'll give you another shot at pensions later, but when we get somebody who comes in like that with an email and wants a direct answer to a direct question, I feel I have to speak for them and get it. So go ahead. Executive compensation, what do you think?
Well, look, I think that the real need is on the front line. We need to make sure that we have services. We know that there's not enough hands to do work in long-term care in many of our public services. So we have to think about the best way to spend money. Does it make sense to have corporate-style wages where people are making $800,000 and $900,000 a year to manage a public service? I'm not sure that it does, but I think that those are discussions that we need to have. We need to talk about how we strengthen those services that people not only love, but actually need.
Okay, let me go to Yasser on this. Yasser, there are hospital CEOs in this province making $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 a year. Do you believe in this economy that your government needs to cap CEO compensation in the public sector at, I don't know, pick a number, $400,000 or $500,000, whatever?
Well, I think there has to be some balance, and we need to obviously continue to invest in frontline services, because that's the most important one, and that's much needed. There is a role for, of course, executives to play to run smooth operations, and these are large organizations, but we do need to ensure that there is a balance.
Okay, I
and
hear
there
you
is
saying
no
balance,
waste.
but I need to hear a clearer answer to the question. Balance is not yes or no. What does that mean?
Well, again, I'm not. I don't think I'm in a position to tell you yes or no that there should be a cap or not. But I mean, I've got a CEO in Ottawa who's also an anesthesiologist, and therefore he's got a pretty high salary. So he's doing the job as the best he can. We need to make sure when it comes to frontline services, there's investment in place. One point I do want to make, I think is important, which has not come up, that when it comes to Ontario, Ontario has the second lowest per capita spending on public services in all of Canada. That's second to Nova Scotia.
Josh, come on in
So we've
here.
got a pretty good balance already.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, and it's also true that Ontario has the second fewest per capita public servants, right? I mean, there is, you know, to say that the system is grossly inefficient, I think, or wasteful, I'm not sure that stands up to both, you know, scrutiny in Canada, but also internationally.
Would you cap executive compensation?
Well, no. I mean, you run a hospital, several thousand people, you know, and you want to have, you know, smart people who have the option of going to the private sector. I mean, frankly, you need to pay them. I'm not arguing that they should be making millions, but I do think that that's an unrealistic response. You want competent people.
No, I don't think any hospital CEO in Ontario is making millions.
No, but you want competent people. You want competent people.
John, what about it?
Well, it's the whole issue of them using consultants as well and other perks. And I think that there is an argument to be made. Once you're over the 500,000, you better be hitting a home run regularly or scoring number of goals. So you need qualified, innovative people in leadership. But by the same token, when there's average performance and you're in that high level of ranking, I think the turnover could reflect performance. Almost all the hospitals in Ontario under the Hospital Association are in deficit, either directly or indirectly. And there's a huge capital deficit as well. So I'm very worried about the healthcare system. No solution for chronic disease and no solution for long-term care.
Okay, Paul Miller, you'd give your comment, then we got one more email I want to get in before.
Okay, I can only say that a lot of these hospitals, there's maybe three vice presidents, and there's vice president of this, president of that. If you go down the scale on how much money they spend on executives and middle bureaucrats, it's staggering. And that's why your hospitals are in deficit too. That's certainly not helping it.
But I thought one of the reasons they hire consultants is so they don't have to hire full-time staffers on the books. Presumably you'd be in favor of that.
Well, they could have an in-house consultant that could probably do, you know, as much as 15 or 20 of these consultants they're hiring, because a lot of them, you know, they've been caught with lattes and Tim Hortons and things like this. So.
4 minutes to go.
Oh
yeah, you think this is a massive oversimplification?
Yeah, this is red herring. This isn't the debate we should be having.
Tip of the iceberg, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, well, this may be the difference between a think tank and a politician. Stand by, Fred. We got one more email I got to get in. We got 4 minutes to go. If private pensions, okay, Fred, I'll come to you on this because you want to back in on pensions. If private pensions are inadequate, why not make them better? Why not increase the CPP? Why not try to make things better for everyone instead of worse for everyone? Go, Fred.
Good point. It's one of the things that the labor movement's been lobbying on for some time. We need to increase the CPP because everybody deserves to retire in dignity. I want to get back to some facts about pensions. Our members, the vast majority of them are in the OMERS pension plan. The average pension there is $16,000 a year. This is not, I don't think by anyone's standards, some kind of Cadillac gold-plated pension. We need to get away from some of this jargon, some of the assumptions that are out there. We actually do need new ideas, not some of the tired old ideas that we've all lived through in the 90s that didn't work for the economy. This is not a race to the bottom. This is about how we create good jobs that have pensions, that mean that people can retire in dignity. It's about thinking forward. It's about making sure that we have resources in communities. That includes making sure that we have jobs for people. It's
Josh,
a vision that we need.
Let me get Josh in here.
Well, I mean, I agree, but I also disagree. I think that again, the debate needs to be around. I mean, when these pension plans were designed, when the CPP was, I mean, people didn't live as long, right? And frankly, most of the rest of the world is having a principled dialogue about their pension system, and that it really isn't happening here. If it is happening here, it's because it's caught in the wrangle of federalism, right? Well, I think that other countries are having real debates about raising both public and private sector pension plans, and I think we just released a report. We're advocating that we should start thinking about maybe raising the retirement age. I think it's a conversation we need to have.
Yeah, John.
Well, I think there's merit in the CPP discussion. In fact, I know Flaherty is convening First Minister's meetings on it. Ontario had the expert panel report, the authors report, and they have intervened to straighten out some of the rules on partial wind-ups, etc. We just passed our second bill, 236, and another bill. We supported those bills. In fact, I support the idea of but that's a payroll tax. The CPP is a payroll tax. So you can't have it both ways, and the government has no skin in the game, technically. They set the rules. It's like minimum wage. They don't pay for it. It's the small corner store that pays for it. So I think, but I would agree, we don't want to race to the bottom. That's not the argument. The argument is growing the private sector of the economy that creates the wealth and have a method of distributing it fairly through tax rules. And I think that's fairness. I said at the beginning, and I say it again, it's all about we're all in it together, and everyone has to take a share.
Okay, Paul, last 30
And
seconds.
Steve?
See you on this. Sorry, Yasser, I got 30 seconds left. Paul, your turn.
Well, obviously, defined pension plans are in attack throughout the country and throughout the world, and that's definitely a problem. I'm a firm believer in defined pension plans. We have a very successful defined pension plan, which should be the model for all different plans, and it's called HOOPS. It's the hospital worker plan,
hospital one.
and it is excellent. And they have a 97% funding, even through the bad times. They were doing well because they had good actuaries, they had good advisors. So the bottom line is we've got to address this pension problem and do it soon.
Bottom line is we're out of time. Can I thank our guest in Ottawa, Fred Hahn from CUPE, Ontario, first time on the program. Thanks for doing it tonight, Fred. Yasser Naqvi, good to have our sophomore back here, the MPP for Ottawa Centre. John O'Toole from the Conservatives and Paul Miller from the NDP on the left-hand side of the table. Josh Yartison from the Mowat Centre over there on the right-hand side. Thanks so much, everybody. Good discussion tonight.
Thanks,
Excellent.